My name is Abigail. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I've been described with words like steady, reasonable, dependable. I live in Portland, Oregon, where it rains often enough that people learn to appreciate quiet things: coffee cooling by the window, long walks without conversation, the comfort of routine. On the surface, I'm a data compliance analyst for a mid-sized healthcare company. My job is to notice what others overlook: patterns, inconsistencies, small details that don't quite fit. It's meticulous work, invisible work, the kind of work that only matters when something goes wrong. People tend to underestimate me, not in a cruel way, not overtly. It's softer than that. I'm the older sister who has it together, the one who doesn't make scenes, the one who doesn't compete for attention at family dinners. I'm calm in a way that makes others assume I'm passive. I listen more than I speak. I pause before I respond. And in a world that rewards noise, that often gets mistaken for weakness, especially by my younger brother. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic confrontations or explosive secrets revealed in a single cinematic moment. It's about something slower, more unsettling. It's about the moment I realized my younger brother was hiding a shocking secret about his job, and how uncovering that hidden truth changed not just how I saw him, but how I saw myself. At first, it was just a feeling, a subtle shift in tone, a detail that didn't align, a comment made too quickly, then another, and another. The kind of inconsistencies most people brush off because it's easier not to look too closely. But I look closely for a living. As the pieces began to form a pattern, I found myself standing at a quiet crossroads. I could ignore what I was seeing, preserve the image of the family we believed we were, or I could follow the thread, carefully, privately, and risk unraveling something that might never be the same again. This story will take you through that process: the slow accumulation of doubt, the internal conflict between loyalty and integrity, the realization that silence can be a strategy, but also a shield, and the moment I chose clarity over comfort. There were no villains in capes, no dramatic showdowns, just ordinary people, ordinary lies, and the extraordinary weight of truth when it finally settles in your hands. I'm telling this now because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that reshape us the most. And sometimes the person everyone assumes is the least powerful is simply the one who hasn't needed to prove anything yet. Have you ever sensed something was wrong long before you had proof, and wondered whether you were brave enough to follow that instinct? If you asked my family to describe me, they would smile before answering. She's the stable one. She never overreacts. Abby's always been mature for her age. It sounds like praise, and in many ways it was, but it also carried something else: an expectation, a role, a quiet contract I never consciously signed. I'm 5 years older than my brother Daniel. Growing up, that age gap meant I was the second pair of hands, the built-in babysitter, the translator between him and our parents whenever emotions ran high. If he forgot homework, I helped him finish it. If he fought with dad, I softened the conversation. If mom worried about him, I reassured her. Daniel, meanwhile, was the bright one, the charismatic one, the risk taker. Teachers described him as full of potential. Relatives called him a future leader. When he walked into a room, energy shifted. When I walked into a room, things stabilized. That was my function: stability. At family gatherings, conversations often circled around Daniel's latest venture: his new job, his promotion, his ambitious plans. I listened, I asked thoughtful questions, I encouraged him. And when attention drifted toward me, it was usually brief. "How's work, Abby? Still at the same company? That's good. It's nice to have something secure." Secure, reliable, predictable. I don't say this with resentment. For a long time, I agreed with them. I liked being competent. I liked not being the problem. I liked that my life didn't create chaos at the dinner table. But invisibility can be subtle. It doesn't announce itself as neglect. It disguises itself as peace. When Daniel started working in what he described as private investment consulting, the family narrative intensified. He wore sharper suits, drove a better car, spoke in vague but impressive language about portfolios, acquisitions, and international partners. Our parents glowed when they talked about him. "He's doing so well for his age. So driven. Such confidence. When I asked simple questions, what firm? What sector? How long is the contract? Daniel would smile in that older brother teasing younger sister way, even though I was older. It's complicated, Abby, corporate stuff. You wouldn't want to sit through it. Everyone laughed. I smiled too, because that was my role. The calm one doesn't challenge the narrative. She doesn't disrupt admiration. She doesn't demand detailed explanations at Sunday dinner. But I remember the first time something inside me registered. Not emotionally, but analytically. He described a deal structure that didn't quite make sense, used terminology slightly off from standard regulatory phrasing, small errors, the kind most people would never notice. I noticed, and I filed it away. Not because I was suspicious. Not yet. But because I've always lived in the margins of conversations, in the subtext, in the details that don't match the surface. To them, I was dependable background noise, the safe daughter, the unremarkable success story. But what they never realized is that when you spend years being underestimated, you learn to observe without being observed. And that skill, quiet, patient, disciplined, would soon become the most important thing I had. The first real shift didn't feel dramatic. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no sudden revelation. It was a Tuesday evening in early autumn. The kind of Portland evening where the sky turns slate gray before you realize the sun has disappeared. Daniel had invited our parents and me to a new restaurant downtown. One of those minimalist places with concrete walls and menus that don't list prices. He arrived late, not rushed, not apologetic, just late in a way that suggested time bent around him now. He kissed Mom on the cheek, shook Dad's hand, and gave me a brief side hug, already half turned toward the table before I fully stood up. Sorry, he said casually. Conference call ran over Singapore. Dad nodded, impressed. Mom beamed. Singapore. I made a quiet mental note. Dinner unfolded the way it usually did when Daniel was in a good mood. He narrated stories about high-level negotiations, aggressive positioning, capital leverage, strategic exits. The words flowed confidently, but they hovered just slightly above concrete detail. At one point, Dad asked, "So who's the firm again? The parent company?" Daniel waved his hand lightly. "It's complicated. There are layers. We operate under different umbrellas depending on the deal." Dad chuckled as if that made perfect sense. I took a sip of water. Then Daniel looked at me. "You'd appreciate it, actually," he said. "It's very compliance heavy." There was something in his tone, not quite mockery, not quite a challenge. "Is it?" I asked calmly. "Yeah," he continued. "We navigate around a lot of regulatory gray zones." Gray zones. The phrase lingered. "Navigate around?" I repeated gently. He smirked. "Relax, Abby. It's legal. Just flexible." The table laughed again. Mom reached over and touched my arm. "You're always so serious, sweetheart. Daniel's just being dramatic." And that was the first small cut. Not the words themselves, but the way the room repositioned me. Suddenly, I was the rigid one, the cautious one, the person who might not get it. My question, neutral professional curiosity, had been reframed as tension. I smiled, let it pass, because that's what I do. But something had shifted internally, not emotionally, strategically. I replayed the language in my mind. Regulatory gray zones. Flexible. Different umbrellas. They weren't inherently incriminating. In certain industries, complexity is normal. Still, Daniel had always been specific when he was proud of something. In college, he'd enthusiastically explained marketing campaigns down to the font choice. When he launched his first startup attempt, he talked endlessly about customer acquisition costs and churn rates. Now, the more impressive his job sounded, the less specific it became. That night, as we left the restaurant, I noticed something else. His car, a new model European, easily 6 figures. "Leased?" Dad asked. Trying to sound casual. Daniel grinned. Cash. Cash. I didn't react outwardly, but internally, numbers began to align themselves against timelines. He'd been at this job less than 18 months. I know salary bands in finance. I know tax brackets. I know what net income looks like after bonuses and capital gains. Cash didn't fit. Again, not proof, just friction. When we hugged goodbye, Daniel held my shoulders for half a second longer than usual. "You worry too much," he said softly. "You should loosen up. Not everything is a compliance report." It sounded affectionate, but it landed differently. Because it wasn't about worry, it was about awareness. That was the first time I felt it clearly. He didn't just think I was cautious. He thought I was irrelevant, and that realization didn't hurt in the way you might expect. It didn't sting. It clarified. Small dismissals repeated often enough create distance, not a long distance, not dramatic estrangement, just a quiet understanding that the version of you they see is smaller than the version that exists. That night, I opened my black leather notebook and wrote 3 words. Gray zones, cash, Singapore. Not accusations, just anchors, because the calm one remembers. And the first small cut is rarely about pain. It's about pattern. If the first cut was subtle, the next ones were softer still. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as a single violation. It arrives as repetition, as tone, as micro adjustments in how people treat you until the imbalance feels natural. Over the next few months, Daniel's stories became bigger. Bigger clients, bigger deals, bigger risks, but the details became thinner. At Thanksgiving, he described facilitating an offshore restructuring initiative that supposedly saved one of his clients tens of millions in tax exposure. Dad nearly spilled his wine from excitement. "That's my boy," he said proudly. I asked, "Which jurisdiction?" Daniel didn't miss a beat. "Multiple. Like Cayman, Luxembourg, Singapore." He smiled slowly. "See, this is why I can't bring you to industry mixers. You'd interrogate everyone." The table laughed again. I felt the familiar shift, the social recalibration. My curiosity became intense. My specificity became awkwardness. So I stopped asking publicly, not because I was convinced, but because I understood the room. At Christmas, he gifted our parents a weekend trip to Napa. First-class flights, a private vineyard tour. Mom cried. "You've done so much for us already," she said. Daniel shrugged modestly. "It's nothing. It wasn't anything. It was roughly $12,000. I didn't mention it. Instead, I listened. Over the next few family gatherings, a pattern solidified. Daniel spoke in abstraction. Others translated abstraction into brilliance. If I sought clarity, I was reframed as overly cautious. And slowly, something more subtle emerged. He began making jokes about my job. Abba audits people for fun. She probably fact-checks movie plots. Careful what you say, she'll file a report. Always light, always smiling. But repetition turns humor into positioning. I became the rule enforcer, the bureaucrat, the cautious sister who didn't understand how the real world works. And the strange part? I allowed it. I rationalized it in quiet ways. He's younger, he's excited, he wants approval. Don't embarrass him. It's not worth creating tension. I told myself that my silence was maturity, that choosing not to challenge him was kindness. But there's a difference between grace and self-erasure. One evening, about 6 months after that restaurant dinner, I was at Daniel's apartment for his birthday. It was upscale, high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, the kind of place that required income consistency far beyond early career finance. As guests mingled, I wandered toward his home office. The door was partially open. On his desk sat 3 laptops. 3, one open screen angled away. I wasn't snooping, I wasn't even close enough to read details. But I noticed something instinctively. The login screen logo. It wasn't a major financial firm, not one I recognized. The name was generic, almost placeholder-like. Capital Edge Advisory Group. It sounded assembled. I stepped back before anyone noticed me looking. Later that night, after cake and champagne, Daniel put his arm around my shoulder. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "I'm listening." He laughed. "You always are." There was no malice in his face, but there was an assessment, as if he were measuring how much I had absorbed. On the drive home, I realized something uncomfortable. The disrespect wasn't just in the jokes. It was based on the assumption that I wouldn't act, that I would always choose harmony over clarity. And perhaps up until then I had, because confronting uncertainty means risking rupture. And I had spent my entire life preventing rupture. But normalization has a cost. Every time I swallowed a question, I was training him subtly. That vagueness worked. That deflection worked. That charm outweighed substance. And somewhere inside me, a quiet recalibration began. Not anger. Not yet. Just recognition. If something was wrong, I would not expose it impulsively. I would not accuse without evidence. I would not humiliate him in front of the family. But I would not ignore patterns either. For the first time, I stopped trying to protect the image and started protecting the truth, silently. Because when people underestimate you long enough, they forget something critical. The quiet one is not inactive. She's observing. There's a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when you realize the role people expect you to play has hardened into something fixed. For me, it happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. We were at our parents' house. Mom had made roast chicken. Dad was in the backyard pretending to adjust the grill even though nothing needed adjusting. Daniel was on the patio, phone pressed to his ear, pacing in slow, confident circles. From inside, through the open kitchen window, I could hear fragments. Yeah, wire it in 2 tranches. No, discretion is understood. We'll route it through the secondary entity. Secondary entity. I kept drying dishes. Mom leaned toward me and lowered her voice. He works so hard. I worry about the pressure he's under. I nodded. What kind of clients does he have now? She waved her hand lightly. International investors, high-level people. It's all very complicated. Complicated. That word again. Daniel walked back inside a few minutes later, a smile already in place. Sorry, he said breezily. Emerging market volatility. Timing is everything. Dad clapped him on the back. Stay. That's why they pay you the big money. Then Daniel looked at me. Abby understands timing, he said. She just prefers spreadsheets to risk. It was framed as teasing, but something in his eyes held steady for a beat too long. And that was when I understood the role I'd been assigned. I was the contrast. The safe one to his daring. The rules of his strategy. The background stability that made his boldness shine brighter. And roles like that don't exist accidentally. They're relational, reinforced over the years, maintained unconsciously by everyone involved, including me. I had been useful. When Daniel needed help editing resumes, I did it. When he needed someone to review contract language early in his career, I stayed up late reading fine print. When he complained about office politics, I helped him craft careful emails. I was his quiet infrastructure. But somewhere along the way, he stopped asking for my input and started positioning himself above it. Not openly, subtly. When I asked clarifying questions, he answered vaguely. When I offered perspective, he reframed it as caution. When I expressed concern, he called it overthinking. And the family unintentionally validated the dynamic. Daniel's in a different world now. Finance is fast-paced. You wouldn't understand the pressure. You've always preferred structure, Abby. It wasn't criticism. It was containment. I was being gently boxed into reliability. And reliability, when overused, becomes invisibility. That Sunday, after lunch, Daniel sat across from me at the dining table while our parents cleared plates. You still at that healthcare company? He asked casually. Yes. Same position? I was promoted in March. Oh, he blinked. Nice. No follow-up question. No curiosity. Just a polite acknowledgement before he pivoted back to a story about a hedge restructuring event that involved complex liquidity maneuvering. I watched him as he spoke. Confident posture, controlled voice, words chosen carefully but not precisely. And that was the thing. Precision had always mattered to him. In high school debates, he obsessed over wording. In college presentations, he rehearsed terminology until it was exact. Now his language floated. Impressive but untethered. Later, as I packed leftovers into containers, I felt something shift inside me. Not suspicion exactly, but separation. For years, I had defined myself by usefulness, by being the stabilizer, the quiet fixer. But what if stability didn't require self-erasure? What if calm didn't mean compliant? What if the role they'd assigned me was outdated, and I was the only one who hadn't renegotiated it? I didn't confront him that day. I didn't challenge the narrative. But internally, I made a decision I wouldn't articulate for months. I would no longer accept being positioned as less informed. If something didn't make sense, I would verify it privately. If inconsistencies accumulated, I would document them, not to attack, not to embarrass, but to understand, because roles only persist when we continue performing them. And for the first time in my life, I began to quietly step out of mine. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen at a family dinner or in the middle of one of Daniel's polished monologues. It happened on a Wednesday morning, alone at my kitchen table, with rain tapping softly against the windows. I was reviewing an internal audit report for work, routine cross-checking of vendor compliance documentation, when a familiar phrase caught my eye. Layered entity structuring for international capital efficiency. My fingers paused on the keyboard. It wasn't the phrase itself, it was the cadence. The same floating abstraction, the same polished vagueness. I leaned back in my chair. At work, that phrase would trigger immediate clarification. Capital efficiency how? Through which jurisdiction? Under what regulatory framework with what disclosure obligations? Language in my field is never accidental. It's either precise or it's hiding something. And suddenly, Daniel's voice replayed in my mind. Secondary entity, regulatory gray zones, different umbrellas depending on the deal. Flexible. Up until that moment, I'd categorized these as social discomfort, ego, image management. But sitting there, in the quiet of my kitchen, I felt something else surface. Risk. Not his ambition, not his confidence. Risk exposure. I opened my black leather notebook and flipped through the previous entries. 3 words here, a phrase there. Dates, car purchase timeline, mentions of international transfers. Individually, nothing. Collectively, a pattern. And for the first time, the question changed. It was no longer, is Daniel exaggerating? It became, is Daniel exposed? That difference mattered. Because exaggeration is harmless pride. Exposure is dangerous. I didn't accuse him in my mind. I didn't imagine criminal masterminds or secret empires. I imagined something far more ordinary and far more plausible. Young professional, fast money, complex financial structures he only partially understands, pressure to perform, pressure to maintain image, and perhaps shortcuts. That morning, instead of pushing the thought away, I allowed it to fully form. If something collapses, who absorbs the shock? Investors, clients, regulators, or family? The rain outside grew heavier. I realized something uncomfortable. If Daniel were entangled in something unstable, intentionally or not, our parents would not see it coming. They trusted him completely, admired him, defended him reflexively. And I had been the one quietly stepping aside. Because I didn't want to disrupt admiration. But admiration without scrutiny can be dangerous. I closed my work laptop and sat still for a long time. This was the moment that shifted everything, not because I had proof, but because I stopped prioritizing harmony over awareness. For years, my silence had been reactive, avoiding conflict, avoiding tension. Now silence became deliberate. If I were going to look into this, I would do it carefully, legally, ethically, not as an accuser, as a safeguard. I texted Daniel that afternoon. Coffee this weekend? Just us. He responded within minutes. Sure, everything okay? I stared at the message before typing back. Just haven't caught up properly in a while. That was true, but not in the way he thought. Because what shifted that Wednesday morning wasn't suspicion alone. It was a responsibility. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that protecting the family might not mean protecting the narrative. It might mean protecting the truth, even if the truth unsettled us. And once that realization settled in, there was no returning to passive observation. Only forward, quietly, strategically, without drama. We met that Saturday at a small coffee shop near the river. Neutral territory, exposed brick walls, the low hum of espresso machines and weekend conversations. Daniel arrived wearing a navy coat I hadn't seen before. Expensive, understated, intentional. He hugged me lightly. You look serious, he said, half smiling. I always look serious, I replied. He laughed. Fair. We ordered, sat by the window. For the first few minutes, it was normal, surface-level updates, travel plans, our parents' anniversary. He talked about a possible expansion into Asian markets again, referencing Singapore casually, as if it were an extension of his living room. Then I asked, gently, do you ever feel overextended? He tilted his head. In what way? With the scale you're operating at, liability, regulatory exposure. He smiled again, but slower this time. You've been thinking about me. I think about risk, I said calmly. Same thing, he replied. There it was again, that positioning. My concern is framed as over-analysis. It's all structured, he added. We operate within legal boundaries. Boundaries can shift, I said, especially across jurisdictions. A pause, not long, but long enough. He took a sip of coffee. You don't trust me. It wasn't accusatory, it was observational. I don't trust opacity, I answered. He leaned back, studied me. For a second, just a second, I saw something flicker behind his confidence. Not guilt. Calculation. Then he smiled again. Abi, he said gently, you live in systems designed to minimize variance. My world operates in controlled variance. It looks messy from the outside, but it's deliberate. Controlled variance. The phrase was impressive. And empty. I nodded slowly. Okay. And that was it. No escalation, no revelation, no confession. We finished our coffee, hugged goodbye. But something important happened in that exchange. I stopped trying to extract clarity from him directly, because I understood something new. If he were hiding something, he would not reveal it under soft questioning. And if he wasn't hiding anything, transparency would not threaten him. Either way, my approach needed to change. That was the day silence stopped being passive and became strategic. Over the following weeks, I did not ask Daniel about work again. At family dinners, when he launched into grand descriptions of cross-border liquidity structures, I simply listened. When he joked about my compliance job, I smiled. When he implied I wouldn't get high-level finance, I didn't challenge him. From the outside, nothing changed. From the inside, everything had. Because while he interpreted my quiet as retreat, it was actually repositioning. I wasn't gathering ammunition. I was gathering context. I reviewed public corporate registries in my spare time. Not obsessively, just methodically. I refreshed myself on international shell entity structures. I read regulatory updates in the jurisdictions he referenced, all publicly available, all legal. And I kept my notebook updated, not with accusations, but with timelines. Job start date, apartment lease date, car purchase, parent gift, mentions of travel. Patterns require chronology, and chronology requires patience. The fascinating thing about being underestimated is this: people don't conceal as carefully around you. They assume you won't connect the dots. They assume you won't act. Daniel began speaking more freely around me, not less, because in his mind I had softened. I had let it go. And perhaps, in a way, I had. I let go of trying to correct him. I let go of needing his approval. I let go of the role of the cautious older sister seeking reassurance. Silence, when chosen deliberately, changes posture. You stop leaning forward. You start standing still. And when you stand still long enough, others reveal their own imbalance. Daniel thought my quiet meant acceptance. He didn't realize it meant I was no longer playing the part he assigned me. I wasn't retreating. I was stepping outside the frame. And from outside the frame, you see everything differently. Preparation doesn't look dramatic. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed. After that Saturday coffee, I created a quiet system for myself. Not because I was convinced Daniel was doing something illegal, but because uncertainty, when ignored, becomes risk. And risk unmanaged becomes damage. I didn't hack anything. I didn't invade privacy. I didn't cross ethical lines. Everything I did was public, searchable, verifiable. The first thing I did was look up Capital Edge Advisory Group, the name I'd seen briefly on his laptop login screen. There were 3 entities with similar names in the US. One dissolved, one inactive, one registered in Delaware 6 months before Daniel claimed to start his international consulting role. I wrote down the registration number. Then I checked the listed officers. No Daniel, but there was a managing director listed, Evan Caldwell. I'd never heard that name before. Strange, considering Daniel had once claimed to be leading structuring strategy for his firm. I didn't jump to conclusions. Titles can be inflated, startups can be fluid. So I went further. I cross-referenced the Delaware entity with SEC filings. Nothing substantial. No registered investment advisor filing, no Form ADV. No disclosure statements are typical for firms handling high net worth client funds. Again, not proof of wrongdoing, but inconsistent with the scale Daniel described. Next, I checked LinkedIn. Daniel listed his position as Senior Strategic Consultant, International Capital Operations. Impressive. But the company page had fewer than 10 employees. No verified office address beyond a shared workspace in Manhattan. His posts were vague motivational captions about agility and global liquidity dynamics. No concrete case studies, no conference photos, no tagged colleagues. For someone supposedly negotiating multi-million-dollar cross-border deals, his digital footprint was remarkably light. Still, I paused. Ambition sometimes outpaces infrastructure. Not every firm wants visibility, so I shifted focus. Not to the company, to patterns. I built a timeline spreadsheet at home. Nothing fancy, just columns. Date mentioned, claim deal location, financial milestone, observable lifestyle shift. Then I layered one more column, market events. If Daniel was genuinely operating at scale, his revenue claims should correlate with global financial movements he referenced. But something didn't align. He claimed a significant liquidity event tied to Southeast Asian markets during a period when those markets were under regulatory freeze due to compliance crackdowns. I double-checked the dates. I triple-checked. The regulatory freeze was real, public, well-documented. Yet Daniel described that same period as peak execution. That's when I felt it clearly. Not panic, not betrayal. Clarity. Either he was exaggerating at a scale beyond harmless ego, or he was operating outside formal channels. Neither option was stable. Weeks passed. At family dinners, he seemed more relaxed around me, almost indulgent. "Abby's not interrogating me anymore," he joked once. Dad laughed. "She finally trusts you." Daniel glanced at me. I smiled. Trust. It's fascinating how easily people define it as silence. What they never noticed was this. I wasn't building a case against him. I was building a map of exposure points. If he was bluffing, I needed to know the scope of the bluff before it collapsed publicly. If he was entangled in something illicit, intentionally or naively, I needed to understand potential fallout. And most importantly, would our parents be financially tied to any of it? That question changed the stakes. Because admiration is one thing, financial entanglement is another. One night, while reviewing public court filings out of habit, I searched the name Evan Caldwell again. This time I expanded the jurisdiction filter, and I found something small. 3 years prior, a civil complaint in New Jersey, unlicensed securities solicitation. Case dismissed, but not exonerated. Dismissed due to procedural technicality. I didn't breathe for a moment. It wasn't proof of current misconduct, but it was a data point. And Daniel was working under an entity connected to that name. I closed my laptop, sat still. There's a particular stillness that comes when possibility becomes probability. And in that stillness, I asked myself one question. If I confirm something destabilizing, what will I do with it? Because preparation is power, but power requires decision. And I was getting closer to a point where neutrality would no longer be an option. They never noticed the shift in me. Because externally, I remained exactly the same. Reliable, calm, unthreatening. But internally, I had stopped being the background character in Daniel's narrative. I had become the only one looking at the full picture. And once you see the full picture, you can't unsee it. The truth didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived quietly, digitally, at 11:42 p.m. on a Monday. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a public corporate registry in Singapore, not because I was spiraling, not because I was obsessed, but because Daniel had mentioned Singapore too many times for it to remain background noise. He described it as a secondary hub, a place where certain liquidity advantages were structured. So I searched. The Monetary Authority of Singapore maintains a public database of licensed financial entities. It's not glamorous, it's not hidden, it's administrative. I typed in Capital Edge Advisory Group. No match. I tried variations, abbreviation, nothing. Then I searched the name, Evan Caldwell. There it was, not under a licensed investment advisory entity, but under a company flagged 2 years ago for unauthorized cross-border capital solicitation activities. My body didn't tense. It cooled. The flag notice was administrative, not criminal. It warned investors to exercise caution when dealing with entities not registered under MAS regulations. The associated company name was slightly different from Daniel's firm, Capital Edge International Holdings. Close enough to be related. I followed the registration trail. Parent company registered in the British Virgin Islands. Subsidiary dissolved in New Jersey. Advisory entity in Delaware with minimal reporting. And then, a name I recognized. Daniel Harper, listed not as employee, as Director of Strategic Operations under the BVI holding structure. Appointed 8 months ago. I stared at the screen, not because of scandal, because of omission. He hadn't just been working for the firm. He was structurally embedded in it, which meant liability. Directors carry exposure. Directors sign off on decisions. Directors assume risk. My brother, the charismatic, confident younger sibling everyone praised, was tied to an offshore holding structure connected to a previously flagged advisory network. And he never mentioned being a director. Not once. I leaned back slowly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't resume inflation. This was deliberate non-disclosure, not to regulators necessarily, but to us, to family. And in that moment, something settled inside me. Not anger, clarity. If he were simply ambitious, he would boast about being a director. If he were secure, he would explain the structure confidently. Instead, he had layered abstraction over omission, which meant one thing. He didn't want scrutiny. I opened a new page in my notebook, wrote BVI, Director, MAS flag, Evan Caldwell history. Then I closed the laptop. The room felt very still. This was the leverage moment, not leverage to control him. Leverage to choose my next move from strength rather than suspicion. Because now I knew. He was tied to a potentially unstable offshore structure. The firm had prior regulatory warnings in at least one jurisdiction. He had concealed his formal leadership role. But knowledge alone is neutral. It becomes powerful only when paired with intention. And intention was the hardest part. Did I confront him immediately? Did I warn our parents? Did I wait for collapse? Each option carried consequences. What made the moment heavier was this. I didn't believe Daniel woke up intending harm. I believed he was building something impressive. But impression without compliance is fragile. And fragile systems fail loudly. The private reveal wasn't explosive. There were no tears, no shaking hands. Just a quiet understanding that the story I'd been hearing for months was incomplete by design. And the most unsettling part? He likely assumed I would never look closely enough to find it. He assumed the role he'd assigned me still applied. The cautious sister, the spreadsheet girl, the background stabilizer. But I wasn't background anymore. I had the full map, and maps change how you move. That night, before going to bed, I wrote one final line in my notebook. Truth confirmed, decision pending. Because once clarity arrives, delay becomes complicity. And I wasn't willing to be complicit. Not in silence. Not anymore. Clarity doesn't immediately tell you what to do. It simply removes excuses. For 3 days after confirming Daniel's directorship under the offshore holding structure, I did nothing externally. I went to work, answered emails, reviewed compliance updates, called mom on Thursday night like I always did. On the surface, I remained unchanged. Internally, I was running scenarios, not dramatic ones, realistic ones. Scenario 1, I confront Daniel privately, present what I found, give him an opportunity to explain, risk him minimizing, deflecting, or shutting me out completely. Scenario 2, I inform our parents, not accusingly, but protectively. Risk destabilizing their trust without full context. Risk pushing Daniel into defensive isolation. Scenario 3, I remain silent. Monitor from distance. Wait for external regulatory action, if it ever comes. That third option was the most comfortable. It required the least disruption. It preserved family harmony, temporarily. But it also positioned me as a bystander. And I knew something about regulatory environments. When action comes, it comes fast. Asset freezes, investigations, public notices, media reports. There is rarely a gentle warning period. If Daniel's firm was operating in gray zones that crossed into red, the fallout would not be quiet. And if our parents had invested anything, even informally, it could devastate them. That was the pivot point. I checked their financial history, not invasively, but conversationally. In recent months, Dad had mentioned diversifying retirement exposure. Mom had proudly said Daniel was helping them understand new global markets, helping them understand. I felt something tighten in my chest. Had he advised them? Had he placed their savings into any of these structures? Had they signed anything? I didn't have proof of that. But I didn't need proof to recognize vulnerability. The irreversible option wasn't confrontation. It was verification. If I chose to move forward, I would not accuse Daniel emotionally. I would document exposure formally. And once documentation exists in formal channels, you cannot pull it back. So I made a decision that Saturday morning. I would conduct a formal due diligence review, not through my employer, not under company authority, but as a private citizen using publicly available compliance reporting pathways. Every financial jurisdiction has mechanisms for submitting concerns about unlicensed advisory activities. Not accusations. Concerns. Structured, neutral, evidence-based. If the firm was clean, nothing would happen. If the firm was unstable, regulatory bodies would review it independently. And that would remove me from the position of judge. It would move the responsibility where it belonged, into official oversight systems. That was the irreversible choice. Not revenge, not exposure. Transfer of scrutiny. Before taking that step, I texted Daniel one more time. Are mom and dad financially involved in any of your projects? His response came 20 minutes later. They trust me. Why? Trust. Again. I stared at the word. I typed carefully. Have they signed anything? A longer pause this time. Then, you worry too much. He didn't answer the question. And silence in compliance work is data. That was the moment the decision solidified. I wasn't protecting Daniel from regulators. I was protecting our parents from opacity. There's a difference. I opened my laptop, pulled up the documentation I had compiled. Corporate registry links, directorship listing, MAS advisory notice, historical complaint record tied to Evan Caldwell, timeline discrepancies, no speculation, only facts. My hand hovered over the submission portal for the Monetary Authority of Singapore first, then the SECC tip form, then the UKFCA cross-border activity notification channel, multiple jurisdictions. Because cross-border activity requires cross-border scrutiny. I paused once, not out of doubt, out of gravity. Submitting meant I could never tell Daniel I had remained neutral. Submitting meant investigation, if warranted, would unfold independently of my control. Submitting meant change, and I pressed send. No dramatic music, no shaking breath, just a quiet click. The irreversible choice was not confrontation. It was accountability. And once you choose accountability, outcomes no longer belong to you. They belong to systems. I closed the laptop and sat in silence. For the first time since this began, I felt steady. Not because I had acted against my brother, but because I had acted in alignment with my moral code. Integrity over comfort, truth without spectacle. And now the consequences would begin. Not because I attacked, but because scrutiny had entered the room, quietly, After I submitted the reports, nothing happened. At least not visibly. No headlines, no frantic phone calls, no regulatory announcements lighting up financial news feeds. Just silence. And that silence was part of the process. Regulatory bodies don't move theatrically. They review, they verify, they request documentation, they cross-reference filings quietly before making anything public. Which meant one thing. If inquiries began, Daniel wouldn't necessarily know where they originated, and I would not tell him. Not because I wanted to deceive him, but because this was no longer about our sibling dynamic. It was about systemic risk. In the weeks that followed, I made 2 additional decisions. Small on the surface, significant underneath. First, I asked our parents to review their retirement allocations with me. I framed it gently. My company's doing an internal financial literacy series, I told them over dinner. It made me realize we haven't looked at your distribution strategy in a while. Can we sit down next weekend? Dad shrugged. Sure, though Daniel's already helped us rebalance some things. Of course he had. I kept my tone neutral. That's great. I'd just like to see the paperwork. The following Sunday, we sat at their dining table, me with a laptop, Dad with a folder of printed documents, Mom with tea she barely touched. As I reviewed the papers, I felt my pulse slow. There it was. A capital allocation into a private international liquidity fund, structured under a BVY holding entity, Capital Edge International Holdings. The same structure Daniel was listed under as director. It wasn't their entire retirement, but it was significant. 6 figures, transferred in 2 tranches. I kept my voice even. Did you receive a formal prospectus? I asked. Dad looked uncertain. Daniel explained it, said traditional markets were stagnant. Were you given a regulatory disclosure statement? Mom frowned. He said because it's private placement, it's more flexible. Flexible, the word echoed again. I nodded slowly. Okay, I'd like copies of everything, just to review. They didn't resist, because I had always been the responsible one, the stable one, and for the first time that role served a different purpose. Over the next week, I reviewed the documents carefully. The paperwork was structured professionally, but light on formal registration identifiers. The subscription agreement referenced cross-border exemptions that required accredited investor verification protocols that hadn't been properly executed, which meant exposure, not criminal proof. Exposure. Meanwhile, externally, Daniel continued as usual. Family dinners, confident updates, subtle jokes about my risk obsession. If he was receiving regulatory inquiries, he didn't show it. But 2 weeks after my submissions, I noticed something small. His LinkedIn profile updated. The title changed from Senior Strategic Consultant, International Capital Operations, to Strategic Advisor, Independent. The company page removed several references to international structuring language, minor edits, quiet edits. Then Mom mentioned something else casually during a phone call. Daniel seems stressed lately, she said. He says regulators are tightening rules everywhere. It's frustrating him. I listened, didn't react. Because tightening rules only frustrates people operating close to the edge. I made one more silent move. I advised my parents, formally and calmly, to begin reallocating their capital from the private fund. Not abruptly, gradually. We don't need to panic, I told them, but diversification reduces risk concentration. They trusted me, and within 3 weeks, 70% of their allocation had been withdrawn under the fund's standard redemption window. No drama. No accusations, just quiet repositioning. Daniel never confronted me. If he noticed the withdrawals, he didn't say so. And that was the strange part. The consequences had begun, but not explosively. They began as pressure, as documentation requests, as subtle reclassification of titles, as capital slowly exiting structures that relied on momentum. No one at the dinner table understood why Daniel was quieter. No one connected the dots. And I didn't explain, because I wasn't moving against him. I was moving around the risk. In silence, strategically. The irreversible choice I made wasn't about exposing him publicly. It was about shifting power back into systems designed to evaluate truth. And once systems engage, individuals feel it, whether they understand the source or not. Daniel began speaking less about Singapore, less about gray zones, more about transitioning models, less certainty, more ambiguity. The structure was under pressure, and pressure reveals stability. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing triumphant about this. Just inevitability. Because when scrutiny enters quietly, it doesn't roar, it tightens. And tightening had begun. The first visible crack didn't come from Daniel. It came from silence. He stopped bringing up work at family dinners. Not abruptly, not dramatically. He just redirected. When Dad asked about the Singapore expansion, Daniel shrugged. Markets are recalibrating. When Mom mentioned how proud she was of his international reach, he smiled faintly. It's a transition phase. Transition, another abstract word. But abstraction now sounded different, thinner, less controlled. 3 weeks after my parents began withdrawing their investment, Dad called me late one evening. Daniel says there's a temporary redemption delay, he said. Something about regulatory review. Is that normal? I closed my eyes briefly. Temporary redemption delay. That phrase only appears in one context, liquidity pressure. It can happen, I answered carefully. Did he provide documentation? He said it's procedural, procedural. The words were repeating themselves like echoes of a language designed to soothe, not inform. Dad, I said gently, forward me whatever he sends. Don't argue, just collect the documents. He agreed. 2 days later, an official-looking notice arrived by email. Subject line, Operational Review Notice. Capital Edge, International Holdings. The letter stated that cross-border compliance adjustments were being evaluated and that redemptions might experience temporary structure delays. No regulatory body was named. No timeline specified. No oversight authority cited. It was crafted to sound legitimate, without anchoring itself to any governing framework. That was when I knew the regulatory inquiries had reached them. Not publicly, internally. Documentation requests, audit triggers, questions about licensing status. When regulators ask questions, liquidity often tightens first, and liquidity pressure exposes everything. Daniel didn't call me, but he called our parents more frequently. I could hear the strain in Mom's voice when she spoke about him. He sounds tired, she said. I think people don't understand how hard finance is. I didn't correct her, because she wasn't wrong. Finance is hard. Compliance is harder, especially when structures aren't fully aligned. 2 weeks later, another shift occurred. Daniel's apartment listing appeared online, quietly. No announcement, just a high-end rental suddenly available. I confirmed it without telling anyone. His car, gone from social media, replaced with an understated SUV. Lifestyle recalibration. Externally, he maintained composure. Internally, something was compressing. At Sunday dinner, he was quieter than I had ever seen him. No big narratives, no global market commentary, just careful neutrality. At one point, Dad asked gently, "Everything okay at work?" Daniel forced a small smile. Just restructuring. Restructuring. That word carries weight, because restructuring means something didn't hold. I watched him closely, not with triumph, not with accusation, but with recognition. This was the beginning of consequence, not punishment. Consequence. Systems responding, pressure surfacing, momentum slowing. And what struck me most was this. No one blamed him. No one accused him. Because no one fully understood what was happening. They just felt the shift, the subtle anxiety, the reduction in certainty, the absence of grand stories. And that's how consequences often begin. Not with explosions, but with contraction. What Daniel likely didn't realize was that regulatory review creates a ripple effect. Banks reassess risk exposure. Counterparties hesitate. Transfers stall. Audits widen. Even if nothing criminal is ultimately found, the scrutiny alone destabilizes fragile structures. And fragile structures don't survive pressure well. One evening, as I was washing dishes, my phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "Did you look into my company?" There it was. Not an accusation, a question. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. I look into risk. That's what I do. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, "You don't understand how this works." I didn't respond, because I understood exactly how it worked. And that was the problem. The consequences had begun, not loudly, not publicly, but structurally. And once structure shifts, outcomes follow. The only question left was how deep the shift would go. The official notice arrived on a Thursday morning, not to Daniel, to investors, including my parents. It was not from Capital Edge. It was from a regulatory body. A formal inquiry notice stating that Capital Edge International Holdings and associated advisory entities were under cross-border compliance investigation for unlicensed securities solicitation and improper investor qualification procedures. Neutral language, measured tone, but definitive. My mother called me before noon. Her voice was thin. "Abby, we received something. Daniel says it's routine. Is it routine?" I asked her to forward the document. I already knew the answer before opening it. It wasn't a criminal charge. It wasn't an indictment, but it was escalation. Regulatory investigations don't materialize from nowhere. They follow trails. Complaints, filings, irregularities, data mismatches. And once an investigation is formalized, control shifts away from those being investigated. Redemptions were frozen pending review. Asset transfers paused. External counsel appointed. Daniel came to our parents' house that evening. I arrived shortly after. The air inside the living room felt heavier than usual. Daniel stood near the window, pacing in smaller circles than before. Mom sat on the couch clutching printed pages. Dad's jaw was set but quiet. "This is procedural," Daniel repeated. "They're overreaching. It's regulatory tightening across jurisdictions." His voice was steady, but thinner. Dad looked at me, not for accusation. For translation. I read the notice again slowly. "They're investigating licensing status and investor eligibility compliance," I said calmly. "That's not routine." Daniel's eyes snapped toward me. "You don't know the full structure." "I know what's written," I replied. He exhaled sharply. "It's a technicality." Technicality. That word often appears when systems begin pressing. Mom's voice trembled. "Are our funds safe?" "Safe?" Daniel hesitated. "Just a fraction too long." "Yes," he said finally. "They're structured." Structured, but frozen. And in finance, frozen liquidity is vulnerability. Dad leaned forward. "Why weren't we told there was any regulatory complexity?" Daniel's composure cracked slightly. "Because there wasn't supposed to be," he snapped, then softened. "These agencies don't understand innovative capital flows." Innovative capital flows. Even now, abstraction. I watched him carefully. This wasn't arrogance anymore. It was strain. The realization that scrutiny had moved beyond his control. Because here's the truth about regulatory pressure. You can negotiate markets. You can persuade investors. You can charm family. But you cannot charm a compliance audit. Documentation either aligns or it doesn't. And if investor qualification protocols were incomplete, if cross-border solicitation violated registration requirements, if disclosures were insufficient, no amount of confidence fixes that retroactively. That night, Daniel tried to reassure our parents for nearly an hour. He framed it as bureaucratic overreach. He insisted legal teams were handling it, but every explanation looped back to complexity instead of clarity. When he left, Mom looked at me and whispered, "You knew something was off." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was recognition. I didn't say I reported concerns. I didn't say I initiated scrutiny. I simply said I was worried about opacity, because that was the truth. Over the next week, more restrictions emerged. Bank relationships suspended pending review. Temporary asset hold extensions. Formal investor interviews scheduled. The structure was unraveling, not violently, but systematically. And the most difficult part, there was nothing Daniel could do now to reverse it. You cannot retroactively register advisory activities properly. You cannot unsolicit cross-border investors. You cannot erase directorship from offshore filings. Too late to fix doesn't mean criminal guilt. It means structural exposure. Daniel stopped posting online, stopped attending family dinners, stopped calling casually. The confidence that once filled rooms had narrowed into legal consultations and controlled statements. And I felt no satisfaction, only gravity, because this wasn't about winning. It was about consequence arriving exactly as systems are designed to deliver it, quietly, methodically, irreversibly. Daniel came to my apartment on a Sunday evening. No announcement, no preamble, just a text. "Can we talk?" I told him yes. When I opened the door, he looked different. Not disheveled, not broken, just smaller somehow, contained. The navy coat was gone, the sharp edges softened. He stepped inside without his usual commentary about my minimalist decor. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where weeks earlier I had submitted the reports. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly, "Did you report us?" "Not me." "US." I held his gaze. "I submitted documentation about regulatory inconsistencies," I said evenly. He inhaled through his nose, slow. "So yes." "Yes." There was no shouting, no slammed fists, no accusations of betrayal, just stillness. He looked down at his hands. "You could have come to me." "I did," I replied. Twice." He didn't argue that. Instead, he said, "You don't understand how hard it is to build something from nothing." "I understand risk exposure," I answered. "That's not the same." "No," I agreed. "It's not." Silence again. Then he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "We weren't stealing," he said. "We were structuring around outdated systems. Everyone does it. Not everyone gets flagged across jurisdictions," I said gently. His jaw tightened, but not in anger, in recognition. "You think I was reckless?" "I think you were ambitious," I said, "and underestimating scrutiny." He studied me then, really studied me. "You've always thought you were smarter than me." The statement surprised me. "I never competed with you," I said calmly. "That's the problem," he replied. "You just watch." There it was. The thing he had sensed but never named. "Yes," I said. I watch. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I thought you were harmless." I know. Another long pause. The room didn't feel hostile, it felt honest. I didn't tell Mom and Dad about the directorship, he said quietly. I didn't want them to worry. I know. I thought I could manage it. I know. That seemed to land harder than any accusation. Because I wasn't attacking him. I wasn't calling him corrupt. I was acknowledging the intention beneath the mistake. He rubbed his temples. They're reviewing everything, he said, freezing certain accounts, interviewing investors. I assumed they would. He looked up sharply. You're not sorry. It wasn't a question. I chose my words carefully. I'm not sorry that scrutiny exists, I said. I am sorry you're under it. He absorbed that slowly. You changed, he said after a moment. No, I replied softly. I stopped pretending. The words hung between us, not as a weapon, but as truth. For years, I had played the stabilizer, the quiet background, the cautious sister who wouldn't disrupt momentum. But integrity requires disruption sometimes. I didn't want you to fail, I continued. I wanted you to be solid. He looked down again. You could have trusted me. I trusted systems more, I said gently. That was the core of it. Not mistrust of him as a person, mistrust of opacity as a structure. He sat there for a long time, then finally nodded once. I should have registered properly, he admitted. We pushed exemptions too far. There it was, not a confession of crime. An admission of overreach. He stood to leave. At the door, he paused. You didn't humiliate me, he said quietly. You could have. That was never the goal. He studied my face one last time. I won't forget this. I don't expect you to. He left without slamming the door. No emotional explosion. No dramatic collapse. Just two adults standing on opposite sides of consequence. And for the first time in our lives, we were not operating inside assigned roles. We were simply two people confronting reality without spectacle. Calm, direct, irreversible. It's been 11 months since that conversation at my kitchen table. The investigation concluded quietly. No criminal charges, but significant penalties. Administrative fines. Formal cease and desist orders across 2 jurisdictions. Mandatory restitution processes for improperly qualified investors. Permanent prohibition on operating advisory services without licensing compliance review. In simple terms, the structure collapsed. Not violently, not publicly shamed on national television, but permanently dismantled. Daniel is no longer a director of anything offshore. He works now for a mid-sized domestic firm, fully licensed, fully supervised. The salary is lower, the visibility smaller, the language more precise. He doesn't talk about gray zones anymore. He talks about compliance frameworks. Sometimes I wonder if he resents that shift. Sometimes I know he does. Our parents recovered most of their capital. Not all, but enough to remain stable. The portion that was lost stung, but it didn't devastate them. And that matters. Daniel and I don't speak the way we used to. There's less performance now, less teasing, more pauses. He no longer jokes about my spreadsheets. He asks questions sometimes, carefully. What do regulators usually look for first? How early do flags trigger reviews? The irony isn't lost on either of us. But what changed most wasn't him. It was me. For most of my life, I defined strength as endurance, as quiet support, as absorbing imbalance to keep rooms peaceful. I thought restraint meant silence. I thought maturity meant accommodation. But what I understand now is this. Calm is not the same as passive. Loyalty is not the same as protection from consequence. Love is not the same as agreement. The version of me they knew, the reliable stabilizer, still exists. I'm still measured, still analytical, still quiet. But I no longer shrink to preserve comfort. I no longer allow vagueness to pass unexamined in the name of harmony. And I no longer confuse being underestimated with being unseen. Because here's what I learned. When you move without spectacle, people assume you're stationary. When you don't compete, people assume you're behind. When you observe instead of announce, people assume you're unaware. But quiet does not mean inactive. And composure does not mean powerless. I don't feel victorious. There was no triumph in watching Daniel navigate investigation interviews or restructure his career under supervision. There was no pleasure in seeing our parents' trust shaken. There was only necessity. If I had stayed silent, truly silent, the fallout could have been catastrophic. Instead, it was contained. That's the difference. Daniel once told me he thought I was harmless. I don't think he believes that anymore. Not because I attacked him, but because I refused to participate in illusion. And illusion is fragile. I'm still the calm one at family dinners. Still the one who listens more than she speaks. But when I speak now, there is weight behind it, not volume. Weight. I don't need to prove intelligence. I don't need to challenge loudly. I don't need to dominate conversations. Because I understand something I didn't before. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about alignment. And I am aligned now with my values, with my instincts, with the responsibility that comes with seeing clearly. I didn't change who I was. I clarified it. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a clean ending, a lesson tied up neatly, a villain exposed, a hero vindicated. But real life rarely resolves like that. Daniel isn't a criminal mastermind. He isn't evil. He isn't irredeemable. He was ambitious, overconfident, seduced by complexity and the prestige of operating in spaces that felt elite and untouchable. He believed he could manage the risk. He believed he could outpace scrutiny. And for a while he did, until he couldn't. What changed everything wasn't confrontation. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was documentation. It was patience. It was choosing integrity over comfort. There's a quiet power in refusing to escalate emotionally while escalating structurally. I didn't humiliate him. I didn't expose him publicly. I didn't shout at the dinner table. I simply moved responsibility to systems built to handle truth. And that's something I think we misunderstand often. We assume strength looks loud. We assume justice looks dramatic. We assume loyalty means silence. But sometimes loyalty means refusing to let someone build their identity on unstable ground. Sometimes love looks like scrutiny. And sometimes the calmest person in the room is the only one willing to act. If I had ignored the inconsistencies, I would have preserved temporary peace. But peace built on opacity is fragile. Now, our family isn't perfect. There's still tension. There are still conversations we avoid. There are moments when Daniel's eyes flicker with something like resentment, or maybe humility. But there's also something new, reality. No performance, no inflated narratives, no gray zones disguised as brilliance. Just accountability. And strangely, that feels more stable than admiration ever did. I don't tell this story to encourage suspicion in every relationship. I tell it because sometimes you already know something is misaligned, and you're waiting for permission to trust your instincts. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, if you've ever sensed that something wasn't adding up but worried about being too cautious, maybe the question isn't whether you're overthinking. Maybe the question is what your silence is protecting. So I'll leave you with this. When you see risk forming around someone you love, do you stay quiet to preserve harmony, or do you step forward knowing the cost? I'd really like to hear how you would handle it.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.